So get your stance, the feet about hip width apart. Weight slightly forward, let your hips drop back, and when I think about it, Rosemary, who I think is here today, after we had that discussion about sort of aligning your feet, was saying, sent me a link through, I think Halfords, do these car mats. But you can kind of adjust them so that you can actually sort of like create yourself a proper little mat to stand on, which sounds like a good idea. And a little bit padded, so if you're looking,
they're workshop mats, Mike. Sorry? They're workshop. They are workshop mats.
Oh, sorry, yes, workshop, not car mats. Yeah. So if anybody's interested, give me a shout, and I can share the link with you, or just have a look around. And when I saw that, I had a kind of hunt around the internet. There's all sorts of things out there, actually, gym mats and that kind of thing. But the Halfords ones have the advantage of being quite cheap. So thanks for that, Rosemary. If anybody wants some kind of visual, sensory sense of where to put your feet, that's quite useful. So, nice and easy, and just bear in mind it's chillier, so give yourself plenty of time to warm up and to loosen up. Gradually feeling your weight settle. And hopefully you're beginning to find that a lot of the sort of detail is just beginning to happen. It's like, somebody once said that learning Tai Chi, a guy called Paul Compton said that learning Tai Chi is like wearing a pair of shoes. You know, if you buy a new pair of shoes, they always feel a bit stiff and awkward to start off with. But over a period of time, they sort of fit, and then eventually your feet sort of just slip into them, and they feel very comfortable. And so gradually, rather than thinking, oh, is my weight here or is it here? Initially, at least, there's this sense of just settling down. It's always worth checking your posture, your knees, your hips, positioning of your shoulders, and so on and so forth. Because if nothing else, that act of checking kind of reconnects you, focuses you into your body. As always, that's a very important element of the Tai Chi. Sometimes I find I'm doing something like this. I'm standing there, and after a while, I'm thinking, "Hold on, it doesn't feel right. This is wrong somehow," you know. And I'm gradually waking up, and then suddenly realise that maybe I'm favouring one side, or I'm leaning over, or something like that. So it's almost like your body feeds back to your mind in one way or another. And I think that the quality of the movement is one of those things that we notice. And I think those elements in Tai Chi, those things that I would label as kind of learning to listen to what's going on in your body, are really important, because they're the things that, as we're walking down the road or washing up or something like that, are going to remind us about our posture and how we're moving and so on and so forth. It's very easy to pull a muscle or something like that. I did it the other day. I think it was Friday, something like that. Anyway, I did my usual kind of like Tai Chi practice, and then I managed to pull a muscle in my shoulder, getting something out of a cupboard. I mean, it's ridiculous, isn't it? But yeah, should have recognised that was going to happen before it happened. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. But you get used to a certain feel within the body. It's like some people can get in the car and turn it on and go, oh, you know, they know what's wrong with it because they're sort of attuned, if you like, to the car. To listening, observing, and that idea gradually begins to extend outwards as well. So it's not just your own body, your own sort of inner environment that you're listening to, but what's around you as well. And just raising your arms. So it's quite tricky to do that without getting distracted by what you're listening to, whether it's inside or outside of the body. And then just drop your hands down. Rocking your weight forwards and backwards. So our minds are quite clever, I suppose, quite adaptable. And we notice things on different levels. So there's plenty of stuff that goes on what we might call unconsciously. But then there's a kind of subconscious, things that we're aware of without having to think about, without almost being aware that we're aware of them. The example I often give to people is if you're standing in your kitchen and suddenly something changes and you realise the fridge is turned off. You didn't walk into the kitchen and think, oh right, the fridge is going, but you recognised it when it turned off. And then there's the stuff that you're actually kind of thinking about in the front of your mind. So the quality of the movement in Tai Chi, the feel of the posture, even the feel of particular exercises, they all seem to operate at that subconscious level. So here, for instance, you may have an idea about where your weight should go to, how far you can go, and so on and so forth. But the real thing is, can you notice the changes in your body and respond to them? Oops, that's too far. That's not far enough. Or whatever. Gradually let your hips drop. So softer in your knees, feeling your pelvis hanging. And just think of your spine as being like a plant in water, just gently swaying forwards and backwards. And if you've got an aquarium or something like that, you could just very gently blow on the surface, hardly any effort at all, to get the plant to move a little bit. And then you want to gradually feel that movement in your spine, your ribs, just expands out into the rest of your body. Bring your hands out. See if you can let that feeling extend out into your arms, and your hands, and your fingers. As you're in the river. Here. So I exaggerate, I go forwards, and then I feel that little bit of a stretch here and across the chest. I just allow that to contract to bring the hands forwards. And then when I go back, there, I feel the stretch across my back, and now allow that to contract. So you could try doing it quite big. The trouble is, when you're here, you're kind of a bit wobbly. But if that helps you to register that feeling in the upper part of your body, that can be a useful thing for a little while. And then gradually making it smaller. Just feeling those movements, changes in the upper part of your body. It's a very subtle thing, not something you would notice from the outside, unless you were looking really closely. swaying in the river. Very interesting exercise, this one. You can, as you sort of do the movement, you're aware of that basic background flow. Just letting the front of your attention focus on different parts of the body, noticing what's going on in, say, your knees, the thigh muscles, around your ribs, your feet. Gradually building up this picture of your whole body moving, all those different changes, very much flowing into each other. Next time you come forwards, let your weight settle, hips dropping back, sinking down a little bit more and rooting down. So remember, you can't really see it that clearly from the front, but it's very much driven by this movement. And line up properly. And it's important that you don't let your knees do this. Apart from anything else, you'll fall over. But what will happen is you'll start to strain. So as you go back, it becomes quite strong in the thigh muscles here. It's like these muscles in particular are really supporting you. And one of the qualities I kind of sense is, if I've never done this, I've never been in a parachute or gone bungee jumping, but I'd imagine that the straps that they put you in sort of firm up. I wouldn't say tighten up necessarily, but you can feel them engaging. And in the same way, you'll feel certain muscles in your body, particularly the thigh muscles, really engaging as you sink down. So part of the feeling that one of the images I sometimes have is of a baby in a baby bouncer. You know, I don't know if you still get them, but you used to be able to hang them indoors, and the baby would sit in them and they'd kind of bounce around in them. And so you want to feel that your body is supported in this posture. And then you bring your hand, as most of you are doing this, but you know, when your hands come into play, that means that, you know, if you think about the baby's arms flopping around, there's that looseness there, and we just bring a quality of intent, a shape, an idea, a pattern, a memory of the exercise, and creates the actual full exercise, or finishes the full exercise off. And then change into the wild goose. So sometimes it feels like there's a particular connection between our awareness and our intent and our arms and our hands. And certainly, I think one of the interesting sort of things that I've noticed is that calmer quality in my mind and the flow of the movement in the arms is really quite connected. It's quite often the first thing that gives away the fact that we're getting a bit agitated somehow is our hands start to kind of flap around or something. That's not to say that we're not aware of the rest of the body, it's just sometimes it feels a little bit more obvious in arms and hands. And certainly from the outside, you can see that quite easily. And then parting the clouds. So being familiar with the sequence a little bit actually means that you have a bit of space for these kind of reflections. And one of the reasons there's so much emphasis on sequence and repetition, building up sets of movements and repeating them over and over again in one way or another, is that it allows us that sense of space and the opportunity to really reflect on what we're picking up through the listening process. And then changing to dragon plucks the stars from the sky. So that can become a very absorbing process. It's not the only important element in Tai Chi, but it's not at all unusual for me in some classes. You know, I'm looking at a particular movement or I'm asked a particular question, suddenly realise that I've spent sort of 3/4 of the class on one particular aspect of an exercise or something. Because as soon as you start thinking about it, it's almost like the possibilities multiply a little bit. And there's a fascination there. So here, for instance, you can feel the expansion through your body, ankle to your hip, and then from your hip up to the side of your body through your ribs, your shoulder to your elbow, your wrist, your fingers. This time changing to pushing in 4 directions. Sometimes it's quite useful to just focus on a particular point. So for instance, here, this is where the hands come to. And then they come up and out. And you won't always get that same precision. But while you're doing it, it'll change the movement slightly. But then after a while, what you picked up in working in that way will just very smoothly integrate with the rest of your body. And when you turn, it's in your hips first, then your waist, and progressively up through your body. Maybe with each level of the body, turning a little bit more than the one below it. Or maybe not. It depends how your back's feeling. And this is another area where that more intuitive awareness goes. I think it was Confucius who, when asked by one of his students about how much something should be done, his answer was very helpful. It was not too much and not too little. So there you go. If you want to know how far to turn, it's not too much and not too little. And I know you'll appreciate that. Let's do one more of these. Remember, weight slightly forwards, hips dropping back. and then your arms drop down, circling palms. Opening all the way through the side of the body. There's some similarities, of course, to stretching between heaven and earth, with that opening in the belly, the lower part of the torso. But this time, if it's comfortable, you can turn. And then switch sides. When your arm comes down, it rotates from your shoulder, not just your wrist. Let your elbow drop and stiffen up in your shoulder. And again, if it's comfortable for you, and turn. And then finishing off this first set, rowing a boat in the middle of the lake. One more time. Good. And then just gently transferring your weight from side to side. So one of the things that we want to become a little bit kind of intuitive, to work for us on that subconscious level, is the rooting down, the sense of connection into the ground. And that's another one of these things that becomes more and more refined. To start off with, it's really just, okay, you bend the knees, and then you realize, well, that's not good enough. You have to let the hips drop back, and so on and so forth. But as I mentioned, actually, there's also this idea that you push the foot into the board. Remember, I've talked about it when we step. You put the foot down and you press in gently. You can do that without stepping. So here, I'm in my right foot, this one here. And before I move, I just exert that little bit of a pressure downwards through the left leg. And sometimes it feels as though that actually pulls my weight across. So it's not just a push from the opposite foot. But notice what you have to do to get that sense of the foot pushing into the floor. You have to really sort of soften in the toes, the balls of your feet, the arch of your foot. And we often hold our toes and our feet really stiff. But this gives us a much better contact with the ground beneath us. But of course, you don't want to think about that all the time, because if that's what you're thinking about, you won't be able to think about anything else. So we practice it so that it begins to just hardwire. So we're going to go into bear play. We haven't done that for a little while. Just swing across, coming up a little bit and then down. So one of the reasons that we practice the more complex exercises, I feel sometimes, because it sometimes feels as though touch is very contrary. You know, the teacher will say, okay, this is what you've got to do. Then they'll give you an exercise that makes it almost impossible to do that. And of course, the idea is to try and, in some senses, to try and make sure that those really fundamental principles are working for us in all sorts of circumstances. This is perhaps a good example of that, keeping the alignment of your body. While we're going into the exercise bear plane, if you remember, so up here I'm in my left foot. As I come up, I just let my elbow come up, like I'm turning a wheel, and push down. And then as I come up on the other side, up and over and down. So quite an interesting exercise in the sense that we are actually coming a little bit more out of line than we would normally expect to do. You can see I'm kind of exaggerating a bit, but pushing out there. There's this kind of swaggering, swaying quality. And that really helps us to get this sense of movement, particularly through our backs. And it encourages us to use our whole body, so the whole of your upper body. Just think in terms of all the big muscles of your back and sides, for instance. Think about, when you see a cat or a dog, or if you see a film of something like a bear, when they move, that sort of sense of total movement that they can sometimes give off. So it's tricky to focus on details, but not lose that basic quality. And what we have here is, in a sense, one aspect of this is if one hand's going forwards and the other one's going back, and then that reverses, the body turns, and the press is down, but it's a circular movement with each arm. And what we're going to do, we're going to make a change from this to circling arms, this one. So I'm going to turn around so my back's to you. I think it'll be easier for you to follow. So just try and synchronize your movement of mine. I'm going into my right leg, now into my left. This time I go into my right leg, and instead of coming over, I let my left hand come to my shoulder, and as I move, I turn and I press forwards, and then I bring my weight to the center, and I've made a transition to this movement, circling arm. Not quite so much movement externally, you're not swaying around so much, a little bit more precise. Mirror my movements, see where the hand is going, how they're passing by each other. Ideally, your weight wouldn't move. If you find your weight's moving, don't strain against that. but the same amount of internal movement, the same amount of movement, energy, if you like, think of it like that, within the body. Giving it its own sort of quality of strength and focus. A little bit more of an extension here. The arm extends out, you can feel that all the way down through your sides, but never locking the elbow or any of the joints. That same rotation in your arm here, the front arm in particular. And you might be able to link that up with the hip. I turn, I feel the rotation in the hip, particularly the front hip, and at the same time, my arm rotates. One more time. And then just shake out. So stretching between heaven and earth is another quite challenging exercise. In particular, as and when we get to a point where we're doing this, and then going down and so on. So sorry, it's this, isn't it? Well, it's similar but slightly different exercise. Doesn't matter, because the thing that's really challenging is in the midst of all of this, can we keep that sense of, you know, the foot sinking into the floor and so on and so forth. I know I've said before, but it's really important that last little how can I put it? That last little stretch is really quite challenging to maintain the awareness of the foot, and the only way to really hardwire it is to just do the movements with the foot. You step out, and we were saying earlier, is it the heel or the toes? Just find a comfortable way of doing it. Push in, come in, bring the foot in, put a little wobble there, and then you raise, and then can you keep that sense as you go on? It takes time. I mean, you know, it's the sort of thing that you have to build up over, in some cases, years, or certainly months. So we'll do the exercise. Start with your hands in front of you. And as always, we'll go through various stages. Just go to whatever stage you're comfortable with. Whatever stage enables you to do the movement and keep that focus of attention on your foot. So minimal movements, right hand pushing up, left hand pushing down. Slightly diagonal line between your hands. They hold the ball, slide past each other. Sink down a little bit as we did with some of the earlier exercises, and then pushing up and sinking. Your weight in the middle at the moment. So this means you've got a chance to just focus your attention on what's happening in the upper part of your body. You haven't got to think about your weight moving or anything. And it's a movement often linked with stomach and spleen, certainly, but that whole area of the body. I think the connection with stomach and spleen comes from the line of the meridian, the energy channel for the stomach system that goes up this part of the body here, roughly speaking. But I think in general, this whole area of the lower part of the torso is quite significant in this exercise. So then you can start to move your weight a little bit. Go across and really sink down. So you sink down, and only once you've got that can you get that slight sense of a push up. So again, if I show you from the side, it's almost like I'm doing this. This is exaggerated, and then having established the root, I can push up, but I really feel my foot sinking into the ground. The useful image here is that you've got a ball between your hands, and you turn your hands out, and the ball expands, and it pushes down through the foot as well as up through the upper body. Sorry, I had the wrong hand there. There's a very similar exercise that I do, which is getting a bit confused with that. Coming down, the ball expands, you feel the pressure in the sole of your foot. And then we can start to think about possibly moving the empty foot, knee coming forwards, heel coming up, more of your weight going into the supporting leg. Until eventually, if you feel comfortable with this, stepping in. So I'm trying to focus on particular points. What you'll find is that you focus on, say, the foot sinking down and nothing else seems to work, or you'll focus on the dropping down and you get that well, and then you focus on something different and it feels as though the dropping down isn't working. It's just, it becomes more integrated into the movement and not quite so exaggerated. So usually when we focus in any exercise on a particular part of the movement, it exaggerates what's going on there. And they become more subtle as we become more used to them. And then that final element in the sequence here, if you're comfortable with this, just raising your foot. Well, perhaps more accurately, or better way of thinking of it is to say that you're raising your knee. The foot will just naturally follow on. Drop down in the middle a little bit, get a little bit of a stretch between the legs. Again, very careful with that. Going back to what I was saying earlier, you can see by dropping down, I'm actually beginning to move across more. So the lower your hips go, the bigger your step. One more time. And bring your feet parallel. That last point is quite an interesting one. I've talked about the width of the step, and most of you have heard me say that you could measure the width from the outside of the foot, the midline of the foot, or the inside of the foot. Any of those is fine. It varies according to the particular lineage that you're working in, but they can all work to support your hips. In terms of length, the same, there's a similar kind of variation. When we step forwards, in the first instance, I always say to people when they're starting off, step forwards, hip width. So you step forwards the same length as you the width of your step. So it's like you're standing on a square. This is where the idea of those mats that I mentioned, that Rosemary told me about earlier, can be a good thing, because they can be square. What I sometimes say to people is get a tape measure and a bit of chalk, measure across your hips, mark out the square, and just stand there, trying to find the right spot each time. I would say probably the point to measure it from, the part of the foot that you're interested in is just behind the board of the foot, but that can vary a little bit. But that's only to start off with. That's to stop us making it too short a step, because this is sort of, I wouldn't say valueless, but it's not what we're trying to do. We need to have the heels in front of the rear toes. But it's a triangle. If I do it narrow, I'm nearly falling over, but you can see if I go from my back heel to my hip, there's a vertical line. And then if I go from that hip down to the ankle in front, there's a diagonal line. And then there's a horizontal line from foot to foot. So what you've got is a right angle triangle. And if you're a mathematician, you'll know that there's, which I'm not incidentally, but there's a formula that links the sides of the triangle, the length of the sides of the triangle. So if I change the distance from my hip to my ankle by bending my knee more, my step is longer. And if I decide to lengthen it, watch what happens. I push up and it pulls my foot in. So exactly how long your step is dependent on that. The principle is that, I'll come a little bit closer so you can see there. Better do it this way now. Yeah, that's better. So you can see that even with my weight back, this front knee is a little bit bent. It's not this, it's not locked back, because that would damage the knee. And also, what I want to be able to do is to step, put the heel down, lower the toes, and feel that if I needed to, I could come back. If I step too long, I fall into the step. So those are the things that we're trying to achieve through that stance. It's very important that you don't overstep, but it's very important you don't understep. And what we don't want to do is to get into a habit of not stepping very far, because frankly, as we grow older, that habit will develop, and in the end, we won't be able to take steps at all. So do try and step a little bit longer. Use the wall for support as always. You know, if that's your normal step, have a go at just sinking down a little bit more and extending the leg out a little bit more. Support yourself while you're doing it, so we don't get into that habit of not taking steps. So have one foot forward. It doesn't really matter. So roughly square. You'll see that I'm actually slightly longer. I'm used to working with slightly longer stances, and with stances that are at the wider end of that hip width. Transferring your weight. But again, what we want to be able to do is to transfer our weight smoothly without losing the overall alignment of our body, without having to struggle. It shouldn't be a strain to get 60% of your weight forwards, 70% of your weight back, and so we get that flow in the movement. So if, for instance, I was on a very narrow stance, I'd be, and I'd lose the flow. Or a longer stance would do the same thing. I'm not suggesting, by the way, that it's not worth at times practicing lunging steps and so on and so forth. It certainly is. It's not what we're doing here. And then raising your toes and your heel becomes a little bit stronger at this point. I always try and build it up in this way, because I think you know, that sense of being suspended by the muscles, being held in the straps. It's stronger here as more of the weight goes in. And so it takes time for the muscles to condition. It's very important that you don't take the strain of the weight on your knees or your ankles or your hips. But these are the ones that are particularly prone to doing that. And then plant, push down, move your weight back. So one of the images I often give for this is as though you're walking on thin ice. So imagine we've all got plenty of opportunity to go and try that out. And we go outside if you feel confident in that. It is quite interesting actually, because your foot will slide around on ice very carefully, very much. So finding that contact with the ground is very important. And then on the other side, and again, transferring your weight. So remember, at no point is your knee going to lock. And then raising your toes and your heel. And stepping in. And then, again, it's always depending on where you've got the space to step into, either forwards or backwards. You're comfortable with this, stepping in. And then going in the other direction. Time. So what we'll do is we'll do this 3-part sequence. Just to remind you, one is this rotation of the arms as the weight moves. When your arms rotate, so the palms are forwards, they'll get drawn back slightly. The weight moves forwards. The movement is complemented by what's happening in your chest and your upper back. We'll then take that into fisherman castanet and then into pushing away. And by doing one after the other, again, we get a chance to just compare what's going on in the different exercises. Very, very subtle changes, particularly in the upper body. Your weight and your legs are basically doing the same thing for each exercise. So starting your back foot, let your hands drop down by your sides, and then just rotate your hands so they're palm out. Push forwards, and as you do, try and resist the temptation to push your arms forwards. Let the transfer of your weight and the rotation in your shoulders do that for you. Imagine your fingers pointing down towards the ground, almost touching the ground, slightly soft, slightly curved in your elbows. And then try a couple of fisherman castanet. Here they do swing out a little bit further. Because it's a more direct movement, there's this sort of, almost like you're rolling a ball along, and that was swinging the arms a bit further, but again, not straining for that. And then pushing a wave with this opening of the chest and an exaggerated way, this action of the elbows. So, weight back, hands in front of you. Now we'll do them as a sequence, going forwards. We'll do one of each. Fisherman castanet. And pushing away. Try not to hurry. There can often be a bit of a kind of rush as we make the transition from one movement to another. And sometimes that's just almost a sense of panic. Am I going to get it right? Am I going to make a mistake here? Have I forgotten where I am? Often what will happen is our thoughts will drift away and we're here and we go, oh, hold on, what am I supposed to be doing? So these are good ways to practice that focusing of your attention and to begin to feel that that too is something, that awareness, that listening is something that sits kind of subconsciously. Do one more round on this side. The more we can get that deep focus in, moment to moment, that sense of really almost concentrating on one particular part without getting stuck into it. The deeper the sense of calmness and stillness feels. Switch sides. So, in the sequence, fisherman castanet. So just paying attention gives you this feeling of just relaxing a little bit, being a little bit quieter. But that quality is really cultivated and developed by this sort of slightly more intense concentration, without it becoming a strain. It's a difficult balance to find. And then last time. And shake it. Put your hands together. Tapping over your face. over your head and neck. Down to one shoulder. And your arm. The other side. Onto your back. Around your hips. Legs. Light on your belly. And onto the upper part of the chest. So one of the images that I've used for this deeper concentration is this idea of sheepdogs herding sheep, gathering, herding your thoughts. For me, that's a useful image that gets me away from this sort of sense of concentration as being something tight and stiff, hard. So when we do Embrace Tiger, Return to Mountain, we can really bring that into the exercise. If you think about where you find your center of balance, whether it be just behind the ball of the foot, which is an acupuncture point actually, there called the bubbling well, or whether it's a little bit further back from that, it doesn't matter as long as you know where it is. Then when we push up, we embrace the tiger. This is the tiger, in a sense, represents just our everyday lives. Lots of activity, lots of sometimes a bit chaotic, but lots of things going on. And what we do is we gather in, return into the mountain, bringing your attention right back to that that point. So that becomes that sort of what I've referred to as the kind of deeper concentration, I suppose. So sinking down, see if you can just really feel that center of balance in your feet, pushing up, expanding outwards. Remember, to be aware of what's going on. We're not cutting ourselves off, but drawing in, already feeling that gravity is working through your body to draw you down into that point. And as we get to there, our hands just come into the sides, almost a little pause in the movement before we push out again. It's not the intent of this art that we simply stand still all the time. It's a very dynamic art, a very practical art, and yet one that always brings us back to this center. Embrace tiger, return to the mountain. One more time. And stand. Lovely. Thank you very much again, everybody.
Cheers, Mike. Thank you.
So take care of yourselves.
Thank you. See you.
Thank
again
you.
next
Bye
week.
all.
Bye.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care on the ice, all of you.